The classic RTB01 Space Marine, iconic, beaky helmed and full of character, versus the towering, ultra-detailed Primaris Marine. It looks like a complete mismatch, but is it really? Today, we're diving into a side-by-side comparison of old and new, seeing how these models stack up, and more importantly, why they both still have their place in the hobby. My Fighting Tigers RTB01 Marines have been with me for decades. These orange and black warriors were built and painted by my younger self. And in a previous video, I showcased my collection. The response was amazing. And one of the most interesting questions I received was, how do they compare to the new Primaris Marines? Well, my brother Richard has painted 3 of these giants up. So let's find out. First up, the officers. Back in 1987, you had to choose to make your officer figures by switching out the standard bolter arms for alternatives, like this power glove and a bolt pistol or a knife. Simple, straightforward, but undeniably cool. The figures had the same bodies, legs and backpacks as the troopers. You could also change the heads, but when completed, they were essentially the same size and shape as the rank and file. Now contrast that with the new Primaris officers, dripping with personality. The sculpting is amazing. The sword is a great touch. And I love how my brother chose a complementary green blade to contrast with the Fighting Tigers armour. The new figures have a presence that the old ones simply don't, at least in terms of sheer scale and sculpting. And the officer figures are given even more presence than the Primaris troopers, so they stand out when they're placed with the regiment. And then there's the chaplain. The new sculpt, very cool, but it feels more like a barbarian warrior than a spiritual leader. I know the Fighting Tigers have a feral edge to their look, but the original white metal chaplain, on the other hand, is all about the wisdom and the mystery. Robe, beard, hood. He feels like a Space Marine version of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Maybe I'm biased because he's my original chaplain, but there's something about that old school mystique that modern sculpts sometimes lack. Now let's talk about the core of any Space Marine force, the standard troopers. The Primaris Marine is a phenomenal sculpt. The proportions are finally true to the law. The detailing is sharp, and it stands leagues ahead of the old RTB01 plastics in the realism. But there's something irreplaceable about the original Beaky helmets. They made Space Marines instantly recognisable, and they still hold up as a classic design. In my mind, if they don't have those distinctive helmets, they don't seem like true Marines to me. I've taken a bit of flack over the years for not upgrading my force, but I'm sure the Emperor knew what he had in his mind when he signed off on this design. Yes, the shoulder pads and the backpack make a distinctive silhouette, but nothing screams Space Marines louder than that crazy beaky helmet. Now this old metal Marine adds another layer to the comparison. These were hand sculpted, which means details varied from model to model. It gave each figure a unique silhouette, something that modern multi-part plastics don't quite capture in the same way. Sure, they're simpler, but when you're fielding an army made of these, every squad has its own character. Every trooper has a slightly different profile for their helmet and their shoulder pads. They feel like real battlefield veterans, each adapting their gear for the fight ahead. So let's look at how we are tying these new modern sculpts into the existing army. We're using the latest paints and techniques with airbrushed base coats and new contrast washes to enhance the details, but we are sticking to the original colour scheme and, more importantly, still doing all of the insignia by hand, just like we did on the original squads. So the new Primaris figures are going to fit right in. And as for the scale differences, I'm fine with that. As far as I'm concerned, the height difference just adds more character to my army. In my last video, I mentioned that I was sure I had an old Space Marine biker somewhere, and I found him. This is the original Medic on Bike blister pack as featured in White Dwarf 102. And back in the day, it didn't even come with a base. I had to make my own out of card. It's a great little model, even if it's tiny compared to the newer bikes. But back then, this was an expensive model. I remember I would have loved a whole squad of these, but it wasn't to be. I'm very happy to have found this one again. And here's another gem from the past, an original Rhino. Well, it used to be a Rhino. I converted this into a Predator using a 1/72nd modern tank turret. I think it's a Chieftain, blending my love of military modelling into my 40k collection. It even has some 135th World War II tank stowage for extra detail. Because let's be honest, a Space Marine tank should look like it's been through a campaign, and all my World War II tanks were laden with baggage. Now I was sure I used to have 3 of these, but it looks like the Orcs got hold of the other 2. They're currently painted in this rough black and red. And look, this one still has the handrails and the alternative front armour with vision slit. But don't worry, they'll be getting a full Fighting Tigers restoration soon. Let me show you the box I found all this in. This is a Games Workshop mail order box from December 2000. The reason I know the date is because I found the invoice in the box. I asked my brother about this. He bought a lot of miniatures, more than I did, and he thinks it's a deal that was offered for subscribing to White Dwarf magazine for a year. Look at the list of models he got in this package and think what an incredible deal that was. Anyway, most of the items on that list are gone, but I'm keeping the box and the invoice for posterity as a reminder of our golden age of wargaming. And finally, let's talk about this Stegatank. This beast was built from an old Robotech Macross Saga Regalt Zentradi assault pod. I stuck to the original build instructions, but I painted it in Fighting Tigers colours, airbrushing a camouflage pattern, and I added Macross, World War II, AFV, aircraft decals. Back in the day, it towered over everything else and gave my Marines an undeniable edge on the battlefield. It was my way of making the Fighting Tigers feel distinct, in an era where Space Marine vehicles were few and far between. In fact, I never played against anyone who had anything like this. And the concept of the Stegatank disappeared in subsequent releases of the rules, when Games Workshop started to define their grimdark style of machinery and architecture, where Titans and Knights replaced the Stegatank. So which is better, RTB01 or Primaris? Honestly, I think they both have their place. The Primaris Marines are phenomenal sculpts and fit the scale we always imagined Space Marines should be. But the RTB01 Marines, they're pure nostalgia, full of character, and have a charm that modern plastics will never quite replicate. But now I have some work to do. These old models deserve a proper restoration, and I'll be fixing them up and getting them back on the tabletop where they belong. So if you want to see the Fighting Tigers roll out again, fully restored, make sure you're subscribed and let me know in the comments, which do you prefer? RTB01 or Primaris?